I have fixed a lot of things in my life. Leaky pipes at 2 in the morning. A transmission on a 1994 Chevy Silverado that had absolutely no business still running, and yet ran another 4 years after I finished with it. A back porch that listed 14 degrees to the left for 6 years before I finally got around to it, mostly because the lean had become a kind of character and I had grown fond of it. And Dorothy used to say it was the most honest porch in Columbus because it did not pretend to be something it wasn't. I replaced it anyway. That was the summer before she got sick, and I have thought about that porch more times than I can count. About the things you fix when you still have time, and the things you wait too long on. I have also paid for things when the fixing was beyond me. A roof in 2007 that I was simply too old to climb. Dorothy's medical bills, which were not something a man repairs with a wrench and a level. I have learned, across 67 years of living in this world, to know the difference between a problem I can solve and a problem I can only witness. That is not a skill anyone teaches you. You acquire it through failure, mostly. You try to fix what cannot be fixed, and you lose something to trying. And eventually you learn to look at a situation honestly before you pick up any tools. I did not look at my son's marriage honestly for a long time. I kept misreading it. I kept thinking it was structural, something with loose joinery that just needed to be drawn together and held. I was wrong about that in a way that I've had to sit with. Because my being wrong for as long as I was wrong had a cost, and that cost was carried by someone who was 8 years old and did not choose any of it. My name is Gerald Pruitt. I am 67 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I have lived here for 31 years, in the same house on Fenwick Drive that my wife Dorothy and I bought in 1993 for $112,400. I remember the specific number because I remember everything about that closing, the way the pen felt in my hand, the way Dorothy kept touching the key on the table like she needed to confirm it was real. The house is worth considerably more than that now. A real estate agent knocked on my door last spring and told me so, with the particular eagerness of a man who had confused a number with a reason. I told him I wasn't interested, and I made him a cup of coffee because he had driven a long way and it was cold, and then I sent him on his way. I retired 4 years ago after 33 years as a mechanical systems engineer with the city of Columbus. Before that, I spent 8 years doing contract work for a manufacturing firm in Dayton. Industrial cooling components, nothing glamorous, but precise work done by precise people, and I valued that. I tell you what I did for a living not because the title matters, but because the way of thinking matters. I was trained to define systems, identify failure points, build documentation, not guess, not act until I understood what I was actually dealing with. I have applied that approach to pipes, to transmissions, to porches, and, as it turned out, to the situation I am about to describe. Dorothy passed 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in March. Gone by the first Tuesday in August, which is a timeline that does not allow for adequate preparation regardless of how organized a person you are. We have been married 38 years. I am not going to spend a great deal of time on that loss here, because this story is not about grief, but I will say this. Dorothy saw people the way I saw systems. Clearly, completely, without the distortion of what she wanted to be true. She had a gift for it that I have never possessed to the same degree, and in the 11 years since she left, I've had to compensate for her absence by slowing down and looking harder, because I do not have her instincts and I know it. After she was gone, I took up running the household with the same methodical approach I had always brought to mechanical problems. I maintained the house on Fenwick Drive. I kept the garden she had planted. I drove my 2009 Ford F-150 gray purchase used, which now has 211,000 miles on it and runs the way a good working dog runs, because I have taken care of it the way you take care of something you intend to keep. I stayed in touch with Marcus. I had dinner with him every few weeks. I attended every school event, every birthday, every ordinary occasion that a father attends when he is paying attention. CTA not counted. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My son is Marcus Eugene Pruitt. He is 41 years old and works as a regional sales director for a medical device company headquartered in Dublin, Ohio. He earns a good salary. He has earned a good salary since his late 20s, and I say that without particular pride or judgment. It is a structural fact, relevant to what follows, in the same way that the load-bearing capacity of a beam is a structural fact before you decide what to build on top of it. Marcus met his wife Renata 6 years ago at a sales conference in Nashville. She is 37 years old, originally from Scottsdale, Arizona. She is tall and well-dressed and speaks with a particular fluency of someone who has learned, very deliberately, how to present herself in any room. I want to be fair to her here, because fairness matters to me even when it is difficult. She was not cruel to me in any obvious way. She was not rude. She was pleasant, consistently and specifically pleasant, in the way that a surface can be smooth without being warm. I tried, for longer than I should have, to find something beneath that surface. I kept looking for the person Dorothy would have seen. I am not certain she found one, and I am not certain I did either, but I kept looking because I wanted to be wrong about her, and because she was my son's wife, and because there was a child in that house who needed the adults around her to get it right. Amara came to them through the Franklin County foster system. She had been in placement for 14 months before Marcus and Renata were approved, and she moved into the house on Cavendish Lane in the spring 3 years ago. She was 5 years old when the placement began, and 6 when the adoption was finalized. Marcus called me the afternoon. The paperwork was complete, and he was crying. Not self-consciously, not to manage emotion of a man performing for an audience, but genuinely, the way a person cries when something good has happened that they did not fully believe would happen until it did. I sat in my kitchen on Fenwick Drive, and I thought, with the specific clarity of a man who does not feel things lightly, this is the best thing my son has ever done. I believed that then. I still believe it. Amara is the best thing to have entered that household. I am simply no longer confused about who understood that. I want to tell you about the first time I met her properly. Not the brief introduction at the house when she had just arrived and was understandably guarded, but the first time I sat with her and had a real conversation. It was a Saturday morning in late summer, about 2 months after she moved in. I had driven over in the F-150 with a cardboard box from a garage sale I had attended earlier that morning. Books mostly, a small wooden puzzle, one of those coin sorter tubes that children find endlessly satisfying, and a set of colored pencils still in the original tin, because Dorothy had believed in good tools even for small hands. Amara was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in. She had a piece of paper in front of her, and she was drawing with focused attention that reminded me of the way a good technician works. Not distracted, not performing, just doing the thing. She looked up when I came in, and she assessed me the way a child assesses an adult when they have learned that adults are not always reliable. Carefully, from a small distance, with the specific stillness of someone who has learned to wait before deciding. She said, "You're Marcus's dad." I said I was. She said, "Do you want to see what I'm drawing?" I sat down and I looked at it. It was a house with a garden, a very specific garden, not the generic flowers a child produces when they're not really thinking about it, but individual plants drawn with intention, each one labeled in careful block letters. Taupe, sunflower, lavender, raz. The spellings were approximate, but the care was not. I told her it was a very good garden. She told me, without self-pity, in the tone of a child reporting a fact, that she had never had one. I told her that Columbus was an excellent city for gardens, and that I had a patch of yard on Fenwick Drive that got the right amount of afternoon sun, and that if she ever wanted to, she was welcome to help me plant something in it. She looked at me for a long moment with those careful eyes, and then she went back to drawing and said, "Okay." That was all. Not enthusiastic, not dismissive. Just, okay, filed, noted. She would see if I meant it. I meant it. The following spring we planted the garden together, she and I, on a Saturday morning when the ground had finally warmed enough to work properly. She took it seriously in the way she took everything seriously. Reading the seed packets, asking about spacing, wanting to understand why certain plants needed more sun than others. I explained what I knew, which was enough to answer most of her questions. And when I didn't know, I told her I didn't know, and we looked it up together on my phone, which she seemed to find reassuring. Adults who admit they don't know something, in my observation, tend to be more trusted by children who have been let down by adults who pretended they did. She labeled every row. She spelled every word correctly that year except lavender, which she spelled lavender with an extra E, which I did not correct because it was close enough and she was proud of it. Over the following 3 years, I drove the F-150 to Cavendish Lane every second or third weekend. I took Amara to the Franklin Park Conservatory twice. The second time she navigated without the map because she had memorized the layout from the first visit. I taught her how to use a tape measure and how to read a level. I let her help me replace a section of fence at my house in the fall of her second year, handing me screws, steadying boards, taking the work with the seriousness of a person who has been trusted with something real and does not intend to waste it. I kept my word about the garden every spring. I want to be honest with you about what I was also noticing during those 3 years, because the noticing matters, and I do not want to pretend I was oblivious. When I arrived at Cavendish Lane, Amara was off in her room or the backyard while Cooper and Renata were in the living room together. When I took both children somewhere, Renata would pack a bag for Cooper, snacks he liked, a change of clothes, a note about his food sensitivities, a reminder about his schedule, and Amara would come to the door with her own small backpack that she had packed herself, which contained, on one occasion I remember clearly, a granola bar, a library book, and a folded paper towel she had packed because she knew she might need to wipe her hands, and she had learned not to assume those things would be provided. She was 7 years old. At Christmas, Cooper's gifts were numerous, thoughtful, specific, the kind that say I was paying attention to what you wanted. Amara's gifts were fewer and more general. Not nothing, never nothing, but the kind of nothing that wears the shape of something, the kind a child recognizes without being able to name it. I noticed. I said nothing. I told myself these things took time. I told myself I was seeing a family finding its balance. I told myself that Renata was perhaps not a natural with children outside her own biological child, and that this was not unusual, and that it would improve with time and proximity. I applied the most generous interpretation I could find to every data point, because I wanted the system to work, and because I had convinced myself that wanting it to work was the same as seeing it clearly. It was not the same thing. I know that now. The change I could not explain away began on a Saturday in October. I had called Marcus on a Thursday to let him know I would be coming over that weekend. I had learned by then to call ahead, though I had not been told explicitly that I needed to, because I had noticed that unannounced arrivals produce a specific kind of tension in Renata that I preferred to avoid when possible. I drove over on Saturday morning at 9:14. The truck was in the driveway. I rang the bell. Renata answered. She was dressed, composed, holding her coffee cup. She told me they were busy. I said I had spoken with Marcus on Thursday. She said something had come up, and it wasn't a good time, and perhaps I could call ahead next time. I said I had called ahead. She said she understood that, but things were complicated, and she closed the door. I sat in my truck for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I know the time because I was watching the clock on the dashboard, not intentionally, but the way you watch something when the rest of your mind has gone very quiet. Something in me settled into a cold, absolute stillness, not anger, not hurt, something more fundamental than either of those. The feeling of reading that has been slightly off for months, finally crossing a threshold you can no longer attribute to instrument error. I drove home. I made a pot of coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, and I took the yellow legal pad from the second drawer, the one I keep for problems that need writing down rather than thinking through, and I wrote the date at the top, October 11th. I wrote, arrived 9:14 a.m. Door answered by Renata. Told busy, not good time. Door closed. Amara not seen. Marcus vehicle in driveway. That was the first entry in what became 62 days of documentation before anything moved. CTA not counted. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Over the next 6 weeks, I made 14 more entries. Twice more I drove to Cavendish Lane on days I had arranged in advance with Marcus, and was told by Renata at the door that it was not a good time. Once Marcus answered himself, and seemed genuinely caught off guard in the specific way of a man who has been told a version of events that does not match what is standing in front of him. We talked on the porch for 22 minutes. He was pleasant. He was careful. He asked about the house, the truck, whether I had watched the game. He did not mention the 2 previous Saturdays when I had driven over and been turned away at the door. He spoke with the careful lightness of a man who is managing several truths simultaneously and has decided that the safest approach is to hold all of them loosely. I did not press him. I noted the conversation. I wrote it down when I got home. I called him directly on a Wednesday evening in mid-November. I said plainly that I had been having difficulty seeing the children, and I wanted to understand why. He said he didn't know what I meant. I said I thought he did. There was a silence of about 7 seconds, long enough to be intentional, short enough to be deniable, and then he said things were complicated right now and he would call me back. He did not call me back. I added it to the log. My neighbor Gary Howell is 59 years old. He spent 22 years as an insurance fraud investigator for a regional carrier out of Cleveland before bilateral knee problems made the travel untenable. He retired to the house next door to mine on Fenwood Drive, where he has lived for 14 years. And he has the personality of a man who does not say things he does not mean and does not mean things he has not thought through. He is not warm in the conventional sense. He does not make small talk. He once described himself to me as having the social instinct of a filing cabinet, and I told him that was uncharitable to filing cabinets, which are at least organized. He laughed at that. That is the full range of our humor with each other, and it is sufficient. I told Gary the full situation on a Sunday afternoon in late November. I sat at his kitchen table, and I went through it from the beginning, the access pattern, the door closings, the call that was not returned, the 14 months of noticing before that. Gary listened without interrupting, which is his way. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need a proper log, not a diary. Documentation, dates, times, nature, contact, outcome, who was present, what was said as close to verbatim as you can manage. It needs to look like what it is, a record, not a grievance." I told him I had started something like that. He said, "Do it properly, and pull your phone records going back to when this started. Call duration, incoming and outgoing. Print them from the carrier portal. Don't screenshot print, because screenshots can be questioned." I understood. I went home that evening, and I transferred everything from a yellow legal pad into a clean format. Date, time, method of contact, outcome, parties present. I printed 61 days of phone records from my carrier. I cross-referenced them against the log. I organized the full document into a binder with a table of contents. Gary reviewed it the following Sunday. He spread it across my dining table and read through it without speaking for about 14 minutes. Then he looked up and said, "She's been managing your access, not Marcus. Look at the dates Marcus was traveling. Every door closing corresponds to a week he was out of town. The 2 times you got through to him directly, he was home. The pattern is hers." He was right. I had the data in front of me, and I had not seen it until he named it, which is the value of a second set of eyes that are not invested in the outcome. I said, "I need to know whether Amara is all right." Gary looked at me for a moment and said, "Then you need someone on that street. Not you. Someone who is already there." The woman already on that street was Mrs. Lucy Coleman. She is 81 years old. She has lived 4 houses down from Marcus on Cavendish Lane since 1987, which means she has watched that street through 4 decades of arrivals and departures and the ordinary and extraordinary events of neighborhood life. She is a small woman with white hair cut close to her head and the specific attentiveness of someone who has been paying careful attention to the world for 8 decades and has reached the age at which she no longer sees any reason to pretend she hasn't. I had met her twice at gatherings at Marcus's house. She had known who I was both times without being reminded. I knocked on her door on a Tuesday morning in December with a tin of almond cookies from a bakery on High Street on East Broad. We sat at her kitchen table, and we talked for an hour and 40 minutes. She did not need a great deal of prompting. She told me that over the previous several months, she had noticed that when the family was home on weekends, Amara was frequently in the backyard alone, not playing the way children play when they are content, but sitting or moving slowly along the fence line, in the way a person moves when they're trying to occupy themselves in the absence of company. She told me Cooper was usually inside with Renata. She told me that on 3 separate occasions she had seen Amara sitting on the front step in the early evening after dark had fallen. not doing anything particular, just sitting with her arms around her knees. Once, in November, she had heard the girl crying softly through the fence slats. She had asked her if she was all right. Amara had said yes and gone inside. Mrs. Coleman looked at me across the table, and her voice was level, but her eyes were not entirely steady when she said, "I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't want to make trouble for the family if I was misreading something." I told her she had not made trouble. I told her she had seen something real, and she had held on to it, and that mattered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know a family law attorney. She handled a situation for my granddaughter about 4 years ago. Her name is Diane Cortez. She's on East Broad. She's good, real good, the kind of good that doesn't need to tell you she's good." I wrote the name down. I also asked Mrs. Coleman if she would be willing to provide a written statement about what she had observed. If it came to that, she looked at me steadily and said, "I have been waiting for someone to ask me that for about 3 months." I drove home from that visit, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I made a cup of coffee, and I let it go cold, which is what happens when I am thinking through something that requires more attention than coffee does. I reviewed the documentation binder. I added Mrs. Coleman's account, date, her name and address, duration of conversation, a summary of what she had observed, her willingness to provide a formal statement. I updated the table of contents. Then, on the night of January 9th, at 11:47 p.m., my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I answered on the second ring. The voice was a woman's, calm but with the careful steadiness of someone who has been composing themselves before making a call they were not sure they should make. She told me her name was Patricia Webb. She said she lived directly next door to Marcus and Renata on Cavendish Lane, in the house to the east with the green shutters. She said she had gotten my number from Mrs. Coleman earlier that evening because she did not know what else to do. She said, "Your son and his wife left on Saturday morning. They took their little boy with them. I believe they went to Florida, because I heard them talking about it through the fence the week before. I haven't seen your granddaughter outside since they left. I knocked on the door this afternoon. It was just past 4, and she answered. She said she was fine. She said her dad had left food, but she's been alone since Saturday, sir, and today is Thursday. She's been alone in that house for 5 days, and I did not feel right not telling someone." I said, "Mrs. Webb, how old are you?" She said 64. I said, "You did exactly the right thing. I will be there in 30 minutes. I was dressed in the F 150 by 11:51 p.m. The temperature was 31 degrees. I drove the 6.2 miles to Cavendish Lane in 22 minutes. I know the route well, and I know every light on it, and I was deliberate about my speed. Not slow, not reckless, deliberate, which is the only speed I have ever operated at when something matters. The house on Cavendish Lane was dark, except for the kitchen, which had a single light on. I pulled into the driveway behind where Marcus's car would normally be. The driveway was empty. I turned off the engine. I sat for exactly 30 seconds, and I let the cold and the quiet settle, and I let myself understand fully what I was looking at, because I have learned over 67 years that it is important to see a situation completely before you respond to it. Then I got out, and I walked to the door, and I rang the bell. Silence for about 20 seconds. I rang again. Footsteps. Small ones, slow, the hesitant footsteps of a child who has learned to be careful about who is at the door. The lock turned. The door opened. Amara was standing there in yellow pajamas with small white stars on them, her hair loose, her feet bare on the tile floor. She looked up at me with an expression I have thought about many times since that night, and have not been able to fully translate into words. It was not relief, or not only relief. It was something more complicated than that. The expression of a child who's been managing on her own, who's been telling herself and a neighbor through a door that she was fine, who's been making her bed every morning and eating crackers because she knew the rules, and who is now standing at the door at midnight looking at her grandfather and is not quite sure yet whether she is allowed to stop managing. She said, "Grandpa." I said, "Hey, Bug, I'm here." She stepped forward and put both arms around my waist and pressed her face against my coat, and she did not say anything else for a while. I put one hand on the back of her head, and I stood in the doorway of that house, and I held on to her, and I looked at the kitchen behind her, and I let myself see everything clearly, and I let myself feel exactly what I felt for exactly as long as I needed to feel it. Then I stepped back and I looked at her face, and I said, "Are you hungry?" She said, in a very small voice, "A little." I walked through the house before I started anything in the kitchen. I want to be precise about what I documented because the documentation mattered later. Kitchen. The counter held half a sleeve of Ritz crackers, a box of cereal, the sugared kind, not something anyone had selected with care, and a 2-liter bottle of off-brand lemon lime soda that was 3/4 empty. In the refrigerator, a package of deli turkey that had been opened and was approaching its use-by date, a block of cheddar cheese, a half-gallon of milk with 4 days left, a container of leftover pasta that appeared to be from before they left. A child could survive on this. A child would have to decide between meals carefully to survive on this for 9 days. Living room, undisturbed. No sign of extended activity. The throw blanket on the couch was slightly askew in the way a blanket is when someone has napped under it. Her room, neat. Bed made with the specific precision of a child who makes the bed every morning because she has decided that this is a thing she can control. Library books stacked on the nightstand. 4 of them in a careful row, with a folded piece of paper tucked between 2 of them that I did not look at, but that appeared to be a list of some kind. A stuffed rabbit on the pillow, slightly worn, which had been with her since her placement. Cooper's room, door open, toys and clothes, and the ordinary chaos of a 5-year-old space. His room had the feel of a space someone would return to. Hers had the feel of a space someone was keeping ready. I took 31 photographs. Time-stamped. I documented the kitchen, the refrigerator contents, the state of the food supply against the number of days she had been alone. I documented her room and Cooper's room. I photographed the empty driveway from the doorway. I did not disturb anything. I worked quickly, and I did not make a production of it in front of Amara, who was sitting at the kitchen table watching me with those careful eyes. When I finished, I put my phone in my pocket, and I opened the refrigerator, and I made her a proper meal from what was there, turkey and cheese and the pasta, warmed, and a glass of milk, and I sat across from her while she ate and we talked. She ate with the focused attention of a child who is hungrier than she had admitted. She told me, in the matter-of-fact way she told me most things, that her dad had said the fridge had enough food and that she should stay home and not bother the neighbors. She told me she had been watching movies on the tablet until the battery died, and then reading. She told me she had watered the plant in her window every morning because it needed it. I said, "Did you call anyone?" She thought about this. Then she said, "I didn't know if I was supposed to." I said, "You can always call me. That is a rule that has no exceptions. Do you understand that?" She looked at me and nodded in that careful way of hers, filing it, deciding whether she believed it, reserving final judgment for later. I said, "I'm taking you to my house tonight." She said, "Okay." She packed her own bag. She did it methodically. Clothes, library books, the stuffed rabbit, the charger for the tablet, a pair of shoes she set by the door before going back for one more thing. I watched her, and I did not hurry her. I carried her bag to the truck. She locked the door behind us with her own key, which she had apparently had for some time. She was asleep in the passenger seat before we reached the highway. I drove the rest of the way in silence with the heat on and one hand on the wheel and the specific quiet of a man who has finished a decision and is carrying it forward. I carried her inside when we got to Fenwick Drive, and I put her in the back bedroom, and I pulled the quilt up over her, and I left the hall light on. Then I went to the kitchen, and I sat at the table, and I opened the documentation binder, and I added a final entry for January 9th. 11:47 p.m. call from Patricia Webb, neighbor, Cavendish Lane. Arrived Cavendish Lane, 12:13 a.m. Child found alone, 5 days, inadequate supervision. 31 photographs taken. Child transported to residence of Gerald Pruitt for 08 Fenwick Drive, Columbus, Ohio, for 3214. Child safe. I called Diane Cortez at 8:07 the next morning. She is 53 years old. 26 years in family law. Sole practitioner on East Broad Street. 3rd floor of a building that has the honest, undecorated quality of place where actual work gets done. She has a particular manner of an attorney who has handled enough serious matters to shed every performative element from how she operates. No drama, no reassurance theater, no unnecessary warmth. Just precision and forward motion. I respected that immediately. I came to her office at 2 p.m. on January 10th with a documentation binder, the printed phone records, the 31 photographs organized on a USB drive with a typed index, the contact information for Mrs. Coleman and Mrs. Webb, and a written summary I had prepared that morning of the 6-week access denial pattern and its correlation to Marcus's travel schedule. She read through the documentation for 11 minutes and 20 seconds. I know because I watched the clock on her wall. She did not look up once. Then she said, "How long have you been maintaining this log?" I said, "Since October 11th. She said, "And you have the child currently?" I said I did. She said, "The neighbor who called you, will she provide a statement?" I said she would. She said, "And the other neighbor, Coleman?" I said she had been waiting to be asked for approximately 3 months. Diane Cortez set the binder down and looked at me across her desk and said, "All right, here is what we're going to do, and here is the order we're going to do it in." What she did was file an emergency petition for temporary guardianship with the Franklin County Probate Court on January 13th. The petition was supported by the documentation log, the phone records, the photographic evidence, the written statements from Mrs. Coleman and Patricia Webb, and a 4-page sworn statement from Dr. Raymond Osei, Amara's pediatrician, a man of 50 years who had been seeing Amara since her placement with family. Dr. Osei is a measured, careful clinician who does not use language loosely. His statement documented, in precise clinical terms, that Amara had presented at 2 appointments in the preceding 8 months, showing indicators consistent with chronic psychological stress and differential treatment within the home environment, and that he had raised his concerns of the parents directly on one occasion in September, without meaningful response. His statement included the phrase, and I will not reproduce the full clinical language, but I will tell you the core of it, that the pattern he had documented in her file over 14 months was not consistent with a child receiving equitable care within the household. 4 words, not consistent with equitable, from a physician who had been watching carefully for 14 months and had written it all down. Marcus and Renata returned from Florida on January 14th. They found Amara's room empty, her stuffed rabbit gone from the pillow, and a certified letter from Diane Cortez's office on the kitchen counter, delivered by process server at 3:47 p.m. that afternoon. Renata called me at 4:22 p.m. I did not answer. Marcus called me at 4:31 p.m. I did not answer. Marcus called again at 4:44, 5:03, 5:17, and 6:08 p.m. Renata called 4 more times between 5:30 and 7 o'clock. I did not answer any of them. I had been advised by Diane Cortez that all communication should route through her office, and I followed that instruction with the same ease. I follow any instruction that I was already inclined to follow. There was nothing I needed to say to either of them at that point. Every single thing I had to say was in the documentation binder, properly indexed, already filed with the court. They called a combined total of 31 times over the following 4 days. The emergency hearing was held on January 28th at the Franklin County Probate Court, Courtroom 4B, at 9 a.m. I arrived at 8:31 with Diane Cortez and the full documentation package. I wore a clean button-down shirt, my good gray slacks, and the watch Dorothy had given me for our 25th anniversary, which I wear when things matter. I sat in the wooden chair beside Diane, and I held my hand still in my lap, and I did not speak unless addressed. Marcus and Renata were represented by Todd Furman, a family law attorney who is, and I say this without malice, only observation, a man who was not given adequate time to prepare a complete response to documentation of this scope and this duration. He made his arguments. They were not without merit. He noted that Marcus was Amara's legal father. He noted the disruption to the child. He questioned the emergency characterization. Judge Patricia Dunn is approximately 60 years old. She wears reading glasses on a chain, and she runs her courtroom with the economy of motion of someone who has presided over a great many hearings and has stopped tolerating anything extraneous. She read through petition and documentation with focused attention. She asked me 3 questions: my relationship to the child, the duration of the documentation period, and whether the child was currently safe and settled. I answered each question with a single sentence and stopped as Diane had instructed me. At 11:43 a.m., Judge Dunn granted the emergency temporary guardianship. She stated her finding. She noted the record. She moved to the next matter on her docket. That was it. No speech. No editorial comment. No dramatic moment. 31 photographs. 11 weeks of documentation. A pediatrician's sworn statement. An 8-year-old girl who had packed her own bag and locked the door behind her and fallen asleep in a truck on the highway because someone had finally come to get her. I drove back to Fenwick Drive and I picked Amara up from Gary Howell's house, where she had spent the morning doing a jigsaw puzzle with Gary, who had been unexpectedly patient about it and had said only when I arrived that she was good at edges. I told him I appreciated it. He said, "Don't mention it." We have never mentioned it since. I told Amara on the way home that she was going to be staying with me for a while, and that her room was her room, and that she could paint it whatever color she wanted. She thought about this for about 30 seconds. She thinks before she speaks, always, and then she said, "Yellow, the kind that looks like morning." I told her that was a very specific yellow. She said, "I know what I want." That was 4 months ago. Amara is in 3rd grade at a school 8 minutes from Fenwick Drive. Her room is yellow, a warm, specific yellow that the paint store employee called golden hour, and that does look, in the early morning when the sun comes through the east window, like exactly what she described. She has a nightstand with her library books on it, stacked in a careful row. She has her stuffed rabbit on the pillow. She has a window with a plant in it that she waters every morning. She comes home from school, drops her backpack by the door. She is working on putting it in the actual designated spot, but we are in negotiations. And she sits at my kitchen table and does her homework. Sometimes she talks while she works. Sometimes she is quiet. Both are fine. I make coffee. I read. The kitchen on Fenwick Drive, which has been the place where I have thought through every serious problem in my life, has become something else now. It has become a place where a child does her homework and a grandfather reads, and nobody is required to manage anything alone. The garden looks this year like the drawing she made at the kitchen table in her first year. Individual flowers, named in careful rows. She spelled every label correctly. She waters it every morning before school, and sometimes she adds things, a stone she found, a small marker she made from a popsicle stick. And I do not touch any of those additions because they are hers. I am not a dramatic man. I have never been. I do not believe in speeches or gestures or the kind of noise that mistakes volume for meaning. I believe in documentation. I believe in showing up. I believe in the specific discipline of patience. Not passive patience, not the patience of man waiting for something to happen, but the active patience of a man who is gathering information and moving forward and refusing to act before he understands what he is actually dealing with. I showed up at 11:51 p.m. on a cold January night with a truck that has 211,000 miles on it and a documentation binder that I have been maintaining since October. That is the whole story. That is the whole of what I did. The rest was done by a pediatrician who had been watching carefully for 14 months. 2 neighbors who did the hard thing of involving themselves. An attorney who does not waste words. And a judge who reads documentation before she makes decisions. A child who waters her garden every morning, who labels every row, who says, "I know what I want," with the certainty of a person who has learned that wanting something specific is not the same as being difficult. She did not need a hero. She needed someone to show up when the phone rang. She needed someone to already be building the case before the phone rang. Some men fix pipes. Some men fix porches. Some men sit at kitchen tables at midnight with cold coffee and a yellow legal pad and build something that holds that. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge.